students. I am so glad you're here. We are reading our Stuart Little book, Still by E.B. White. It is fiction because, number one, a mouse can't talk, obviously. But we are on chapter 3. I just want to remind you, please, 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 make sure you get your iStation done and your reading test on Mastery Connect today, your assessment, because we have Fun Friday this afternoon and we're going to play some videos and play a game, and I really want you to be there. Make sure you get your stuff done, please. If you aren't sure what you need to get done, ask me and I will tell you. Alrighty, we have seen Stuart be super helpful to his family the last couple of chapters, and now we are on chapter 4, titled Exercise. One fine morning in the month of May, when Stuart was 3 years old, he arose early, as it was his custom, washed and dressed himself, took his hat and cane, and went downstairs into the living room to see what everyone was doing. Nobody was around but Snowbell, the white cat belonging to Mrs. Little. Snowbell was another early riser, and this morning he was lying on the rug in the middle of a room, thinking about the days when he was just a kitten. "Good morning," said Stuart. "Hello," replied Snowbell sharply. "You're up early, aren't you?" Stuart looked at his watch. "Yes," he said. "It's only 5 minutes past 6, but I felt good and thought I could come down and get a little exercise." "I should think you'd get all the exercise you want up there in the bathroom, banging around, waking up all the rest of us trying to get that water started so you can brush your teeth. Your teeth aren't really big enough to brush anyway. Want to see a good set? Look at mine." Snowbell opened his mouth, showed 2 rows of gleaming white teeth, sharp as needles. "Very nice," said Stuart, "but mine are all right, too, even though they're small. As for exercise, I take all I can get. I bet my stomach muscles are firmer than yours." "I bet they're not," said the cat. "I bet they are," said Stuart. "They're like iron bands." "I bet they're not," said the cat. Stuart glanced around the room to see what he could do to Snowbell, what good muscles he had. He spied the drawn window shade on the east window, with its shade and cord and ring like a trapeze, and it gave him an idea. Climbing to the window sill, he took off his hat and laid down his cane. "You can't do this," he said to the cat, and he ran and jumped onto the ring, the way acrobats do in a circus, meaning to pull himself up. A surprising thing happened. Stuart had taken such a hard jump that it started the shade. With a loud snap, the shade flew up clear to the top of the window, dragging Stuart along with it, rolling him up inside so that he couldn't budge. "Holy mackerel," said Snowbell, who was almost as surprised as Stuart Little. "I guess that'll teach you not to show off your muscles." "Help, let me out," cried Stuart. He was frightened and bruised inside the rolled-up shade, and he could hardly breathe. But his voice was so weak that nobody heard. Snowbell just chuckled. He was not fond of Stuart, and it didn't bother him that Stuart was all wrapped up in a window shade, crying and hurt and unable to get out. Instead of running upstairs and telling Mr. and Mrs. Little about the accident, Snowbell did a curious thing. He glanced around to see if anybody was looking. Then he leapt softly to the window sill, picked up Stuart's hat and cane in his mouth, carried them to the pantry, and laid them in the entrance to the mouse hole. When Mrs. Little came down later and found them there, she gave a shrill scream which brought everybody on the run. "It happened!" she cried. "What has?" asked her husband. "Stuart's down in the mouse hole." So Snowbell tricked everybody and made it look like Stuart left. I'm going to go ahead and read chapter 5 because I can't leave you hanging like this. Chapter 5, Rescued. George was in favor of ripping up the pantry floor. He ran, got his hammer, his screwdriver, and an ice pick. "I'll have this old floor up in double quick time," he said, inserting his screwdriver under the edge of the first board and giving a vigorous pry. "We will not rip up this floor till we have a good search," announced Mr. Little. "That's fine, old George. You can put that hammer away where you got it." "Oh, all right," said George. "I see that nobody in this house cares about Stuart but me." Mrs. Little began to cry. My poor dear little son," she said. I know he'll get wedged somewhere." Just because you can't travel comfortably in a mouse hole doesn't mean that it isn't perfectly suitable for Stuart, said Mr. Little. Just don't get yourself all worked up. Maybe we ought to lower some food to him, suggested George. That's what the state police did when a man got stuck in a cave. George darted into the kitchen and came back with a dish of applesauce. We can pour some of this in, and he will run down to where he is. George spooned a bit of the applesauce and started to poke it into the hole. Stop that, bellowed Mr. Little. George, will you please kindly let me handle the situation? Put that applesauce away immediately. Mr. Little glared fiercely at George. I was just trying to help my own brother, said George, shaking his head as he carried the sauce back to the kitchen. Let's all call to Stuart, suggested Mrs. Little. It's quite possible that the mouse hole branches and twists about and that he has lost his way. Very well, said Mr. Little. I will count to 3, then we will call, then we will all keep perfectly quiet for 3 seconds, listening for the answer. He took out his watch. Mr. and Mrs. Little and George got down on their hands and knees, put their mouths as close to the mouse hole, and they all called, Stuart! And then they all kept perfectly still for 3 seconds. Stuart, from his cramped position inside the rolled-up shade, heard them yelling in the pantry and called, Here I am! But he had such a weak voice and was so far inside the shade that all the members of the family did not hear his answering cry. Again, said Mr. Stuart. 1, 2, 3. Stuart! It was no use. No answer was heard. Mrs. Little went to her bedroom, lay down, and sobbed. Mr. Little went to the telephone and called up the Bureau for Missing Persons, but when the man asked for a description of Stuart and was told that he was only 2 inches high, he hung up in disgust. There's that picture. They're all calling for Stuart. George, meantime, went down to the cellar and hunted around to see if he could find the other entrance to the mouse hole. He moved many great trunks, suitcases, flower pots, baskets, boxes, and broken chairs from one end of the cellar to the other in order to get at the section of the wall which he thought was likeliest, but found no mouse hole. He did, however, come across an old discarded rowing machine of Mr. Little's and became interested in this, carried it upstairs with some difficulty, and spent the rest of the morning rowing. When lunchtime came, everybody had forgotten about breakfast. All 3 sat down to a lamb stew, which Mrs. Little had prepared, but it was a very sad meal. Each one trying not to stare at the empty chair which Stuart always occupied, right next to Mrs. Little's glass of water. No one cared to eat, so great was the sorrow. George ate a bit of dessert, but nothing else. When lunch was over, Mrs. Little broke out crying again, and as she thought Stuart might be dead. Nonsense, growled Mr. Little. If he is dead, said George, we ought to pull down the shades all through the house. And he raced to the windows and began pulling down the shades. George, said Mr. Little in an exasperated tone, if you don't stop acting in an idiotic fashion, I will have to punish you. We are all having enough trouble today without having to cope with your foolishness. But George had already run into the living room and began to darken. To show his respect for the dead, he pulled a cord and out dropped Stuart out onto the windowsill. Well, for the love of Pete, said George, look who's here, Mom. It's about time somebody pulled down that shade, remarked Stuart. That's all I can say. He was quite weak and hungry. Mrs. Little was so overjoyed to see him that she kept right on crying. Of course, everybody wanted to know what happened. It was simply an accident that might happen to anybody, said Stuart. As for my hat and cane being found at the entrance to the mouse hole, you can draw your own conclusions. So they found him. Man, it's a difficult world for a mouse in a human world. Kate, remember you need to get your stuff done so we can have a fabulous Friday. All right, let's go have a great day, scholars.